They say revenge is best served cold, but sometimes revenge doesn't come in the form of anger or even words. Sometimes it's a quiet moment, a decision so simple yet so devastating that it shakes an entire sport to its core. For Caitlin Clark, revenge wasn't a heated argument or a fiery clapback on social media. Her revenge was a single word, a decision to walk away from a deal that would have handed her over $1 million for just 8 weeks of basketball. On paper, it looked like free money, but in reality, it was the ultimate payback. Because that contract wasn't just an offer, it was a lifeline, extended by the very man who once dismissed her, belittled her, and tried to frame her as just another name in a long list of stars he claimed to have seen before. And when she said no, it wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation, delivered directly to the one person who never thought he could be humbled. This is not just a sports story. It's not just about stats, trophies, or highlight reels. This is about power, about an old guard that ruled women's basketball for decades, suddenly realizing the game no longer revolves around them. It's about an ego so inflated that it blinded a legend to the future standing right in front of him. And it's about the moment that future decided she didn't need him, not for validation, not for opportunity, and definitely not for a paycheck. Because Caitlin Clark's rise isn't just about basketball. It's about shifting the balance of power. It's about the torch being ripped away from those who thought they could hold on to it forever. And the way it happened? Quietly, brutally, with one perfectly timed rejection that cost millions and left an entire legacy in shambles. Make no mistake, this wasn't an accident. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every backhanded compliment led to this moment. And the beauty of it, Clark never had to plan revenge. All she had to do was keep being herself, keep breaking records, keep proving everyone wrong, until the very man who ignored her as a teenager came crawling back with a contract in hand. And when that day came, she didn't even hesitate. So buckle up, because the story you're about to hear is bigger than a game, bigger than a rivalry, and bigger than a paycheck. This is the untold story of how Caitlin Clark didn't just reject the league, she dismantled the empire of one of basketball's most powerful figures with a single, devastating word. Every great revenge story begins with a mistake, and Geno Auriemma's mistake wasn't a bad play call or a tough loss. It was something far worse. It was a choice. A blind spot that would come back to haunt him in ways he could have never imagined. You see, before Caitlin Clark became the face of women's basketball, before the sold-out arenas, the record-breaking TV ratings, and the Rookie of the Year trophy, she was just a kid with a dream. And like so many young hoopers, that dream was spelled out in 4 letters: UConn. Caitlin admitted it herself in interviews. UConn wasn't just another program, it was the program. The place every girl growing up wanted to be. The dynasty, the empire, the dream factory where legends like Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, and Breanna Stewart were forged. For Clark, it was the mountaintop. She once said, "I loved UConn. I thought they were the coolest place on earth." So when it came time for her recruitment, the path seemed obvious. The most gifted offensive talent of her generation, knocking on the door of the greatest recruiter the sport had ever seen. It should have been a match made in basketball heaven, but it wasn't. Because when Clark looked toward UConn, UConn barely looked back. According to Clark herself, the interest was never really there. Geno's staff reached out casually through her AAU coach, a call here, a little check-in there. But not once did Geno himself pick up the phone. Not once did he talk directly to Caitlin. Not once did he talk to her family. The message was clear. He wasn't interested enough to bother. And when people asked why, Geno's explanation was a masterclass in arrogance. He claimed he had already committed to Paige Bueckers very early and didn't want 2 point guards at the same time. Fair enough on the surface. But then came the kicker. The part that turned a simple excuse into an insult. Geno suggested that if Clark really wanted UConn, she should have called him. Think about that. the most decorated recruiter in the history of women's college basketball, known for spotting and locking up talent years before anyone else, looked at Caitlin Clark and shrugged, then blamed a teenager for not chasing him harder. That wasn't just a missed opportunity. That was disrespect, the kind you don't forget.
Because while Geno was brushing her off, Clark was watching closely. And deep down, she knew exactly what that meant. She wasn't their priority. She wasn't their chosen star. In Geno's mind, she wasn't UConn material. And so the so-called king of women's basketball closed the door. A door that, in hindsight, he should have torn off its hinges to keep open. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't just another prospect. She wasn't the next Paige or the next Diana. She was something entirely different. A generational supernova waiting to explode. But by the time Geno realized it, it was too late. Clark chose Iowa, a program without UConn's banners, without UConn's mystique, without UConn's legacy. But it gave her something Geno never offered: belief. And that decision, the fork in the road that sent her to Iowa, would change the entire landscape of the sport. Because that rejection, that first dismissal, would become the most expensive mistake in women's basketball history. A mistake measured not just in wins and losses, but in millions of dollars, millions of fans, and millions of eyes that UConn will never get back. When Caitlin Clark chose Iowa, most people didn't see it as the beginning of a revolution. To many, it looked like a consolation prize. After all, Iowa wasn't UConn. It wasn't a dynasty. It wasn't the place young stars dreamed of when they hung posters on their bedroom wall. But Clark wasn't looking for tradition. She was looking for freedom, a place where she wouldn't be somebody else's second choice or another star molded into an existing system. And Iowa, she wasn't just a recruit. She was the recruit. And from day one, she took ownership of the program in a way that UConn never would have allowed. It started small. Packed gyms in Iowa City, highlight reels on social media that spread like wildfire. Her logo threes weren't just shots, they were statements. Every deep bomb she hit was a reminder that the sport was evolving, and she was the one pushing it forward. And while Geno was busy protecting his throne, Clark was out there building an empire of her own, one bucket at a time. The numbers were staggering. Sellouts became routine. Entire arenas turned into shrines for Clark's game. Road games? They felt like rock concerts, with fans showing up just to witness her magic, even if it meant cheering against their own team. Television ratings shattered records. Networks that once ignored women's basketball were suddenly putting Clark front and center, because she wasn't just bringing fans, she was creating a movement. And here's the thing, none of it was accidental. Clark didn't stumble into superstardom. She willed it into existence. She didn't need UConn's banners to validate her. She didn't need Geno's stamp of approval. She took the pieces Iowa gave her and turned them into gold. Meanwhile, Geno watched from afar, and instead of admitting that he had missed out on the greatest offensive player of a generation, he doubled down. He chose arrogance over honesty, pride over humility. Rather than acknowledging Clark as the face of the sport, he tried to downplay her rise, tried to act like he had seen it all before, tried to convince the world that this wasn't anything new. But everyone else could see it. This was new. Because while UConn clung to its fading dominance, Clark was out there redefining what dominance even meant. She wasn't just winning games. She was rewriting the rules of attention, money, and power in women's basketball. Suddenly, little girls weren't dreaming of wearing UConn blue. They were dreaming of wearing Caitlin Clark's number. And that's the part Geno could never control. Because you can dismiss a player, you can downplay her stats, you can pretend she's just another name. But what you can't do is stop millions of people from believing. And by the time Clark's empire began to stretch beyond Iowa, into national headlines, international coverage, and even into the WNBA, Gino's dismissals were starting to look less like wisdom and more like bitterness. What he once considered a slight miscalculation was turning into something far worse, a public reminder that he no longer had the power to decide who mattered in women's basketball. And the more Clark built, the smaller he looked. For a while, Geno stayed quiet. He could have admitted his mistake. He could have said, "Yeah, we missed out, but look at what she's doing. That's special." That kind of humility might have earned him respect. But humility isn't Geno's style. Instead, he started talking. And every time Caitlin Clark's name came up, the same pattern followed. A sprinkle of praise wrapped nicely in a package of dismissal. When asked about her game, he'd smile, lean back, and deliver lines like, "Kid's fearless. She just plays, like a little kid in the driveway." Sounds flattering at first, right? But listen closer. In Geno's world, Clark wasn't a once-in-a-generation athlete. She was just a kid messing around, nothing more. He turned her brilliance into something casual, something ordinary. And he didn't stop there. Anytime someone tried to put Clark in her own category, he made sure to drag her back down into comparisons. Over and over, he would pivot to Paige Booker's. If Clark was tough, well, so was Paige. If Clark connected with fans, sure, but Paige did too. The compliments were always tethered to a reminder. In Geno's world, UConn still produced the stars worth talking about. It wasn't random, it was calculated. A quiet power play designed to keep control of the narrative. If Clark's success could be framed as nothing new, then Geno could still pretend he was the kingmaker, that her spotlight was somehow tied to the players he chose, the dynasty he built.
But here's the problem with backhanded compliments. People notice. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. Even other coaches noticed. They saw through the act. They saw a man who couldn't give pure respect without twisting it, without inserting himself into the story. And the more he did it, the worse it looked. Because Clark's game didn't need qualifiers. Her performances didn't need to be balanced with comparisons. She was putting up numbers no one had ever seen, breaking records left and right, drawing crowds bigger than entire professional franchises. Yet here was Geno, still clinging to his throne, still trying to remind the world that he was in charge. It was subtle, but it revealed everything. Behind the smile, behind the compliments, there was something else: insecurity. The kind that only comes when you realize the spotlight is moving away and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And soon, the mask slipped completely, because those little digs, those sly comparisons, weren't enough anymore. Geno went from throwing shade at Clark to throwing punches at the very people who supported her. For a while, Geno's strategy was subtle, a little shade here, a little comparison there. But eventually, he couldn't hold it in anymore. The compliments stopped, the mask slipped, and what came out next was pure frustration. In June of 2024, during an interview on The Dan Patrick Show, Geno Auriemma did the unthinkable. He didn't just talk about Caitlin Clark, he went after the people who supported her. Think about that for a second. This is a Hall of Fame coach, a man with multiple national championships, a guy who's supposed to represent the pinnacle of the sport. And yet, instead of showing grace, instead of celebrating the energy Clark was bringing to women's basketball, he insulted the very lifeblood of the movement. His words, brutal. He called her supporters delusional, said they were unknowledgeable, even went as far as to label them so stupid it gives women's basketball a bad name. Why? Because fans dared to believe. Because they predicted that Caitlin Clark could finish in the top 4 of MVP voting as a rookie. To him, that wasn't just wrong, it was laughable. To him, Clark's fans weren't passionate, they were a problem. And just like that, Geno crossed the line he could never walk back. This wasn't about analysis anymore.
This wasn't a coach breaking down a player's strengths and weaknesses. This was personal. This was a direct shot at the millions of new eyes that Clark had brought to the game. The families packing arenas, the kids wearing her jersey, the casual sports fans who tuned in for the first time because they couldn't resist her magic. And let's be clear, this wasn't just another opinion from another coach. This was Geno Auriemma. When he talks, people listen, which made his comments all the more damaging and all the more revealing. Because by calling her fans delusional, he wasn't just underestimating them, he was underestimating her. He was saying, this hype isn't real. These people don't understand the game. And when the dust settles, I'll be proven right. But here's where the story gets delicious. Geno wasn't proven right. He was proven dead wrong. Because Caitlin Clark didn't clap back. She didn't post a cryptic tweet. She didn't go on a rant. She didn't need to. She had something far more powerful than words: the court. And what she did on that court didn't just silence Geno, it embarrassed him. She went out and won Rookie of the Year. She made first-team All-WNBA. And when the MVP voting came in, she finished exactly fourth, right where her so-called delusional fans had predicted. It wasn't just a win for Clark, it was a systematic demolition of Geno's credibility. Every insult, every dismissal, every arrogant soundbite crumbled in the face of reality. His attack on the fans now reads like one of the worst takes in sports history. The wise elder who once saw himself as the gatekeeper of basketball knowledge, exposed, bitter, out of touch. And the worst part? He did it to himself. Because Clark's success wasn't just personal vindication, it was collective vindication. For every fan Geno insulted, for every kid he called delusional, for every new supporter he dismissed as stupid. And the more Clark thrived, the more obvious it became. Geno wasn't criticizing her fans because they were wrong. He was criticizing them because they were right. Revenge usually comes with noise, angry words, heated debates, public battles played out in the media. But Caitlin Clark's revenge? It was silent. And that silence was louder than anything Geno Auriemma could ever say.
She didn't respond to his insults. She didn't clap back at his fans being called stupid or delusional. She didn't go on social media to start a war. Instead, she went back to what she's always done: hoop. And the way she played turned every one of his criticisms into a punchline. Because while Geno was on talk shows dismissing her hype, Clark was rewriting history. Night after night, she was putting up numbers that even seasoned pros couldn't match. Long-range threes from the logo, crossovers that left defenders frozen, assists that looked like they belonged in highlight reels for weeks. She wasn't just surviving her rookie season, she was thriving. And when the awards rolled in, they told the story perfectly. Rookie of the Year, first team All-WNBA, and the crown jewel of it all, fourth place in the MVP race. Exactly where her so-called delusional fans had predicted she would finish. Do you see the beauty in that? Without ever saying a word, Clark and her fans demolished Geno's credibility. He called them clueless, she proved them prophetic. He said they didn't understand the game, she showed they understood it better than he did. It was almost poetic. Every bucket she scored was a rebuttal. Every record she broke was a clapback. Every arena she sold out was a reminder that this wasn't hype, it was reality. And while she rose higher and higher, Geno's words aged like milk. What once sounded like authority now sounded like bitterness. What once felt like wisdom now felt like insecurity. He tried to position himself as the gatekeeper, the all-knowing elder statesman. But Clark's game made him look like what he really was, a man out of touch, watching the game pass him by. The irony is, Clark didn't even need revenge. She wasn't playing for him. She wasn't chasing his approval. She wasn't trying to prove him wrong. She was just being herself. And in doing so, she exposed him without lifting a finger. That's the power of silent revenge. It doesn't need shouting. It doesn't need drama. It just needs results. And Caitlin Clark delivered those results so emphatically that Geno couldn't escape them. By the end of her rookie season, it wasn't just about whether she had lived up to the hype. It was about how completely she had shattered the doubts. And for Geno, there was no escape hatch. Every word he had spoken, every insult he had thrown at her fans came back like a boomerang, hitting him square in the face. The man who once saw himself as untouchable had been humbled, and the person who did it didn't even raise her voice. For most people, getting proven wrong would be the end of the story. You take the L, you move on, you stop poking the bear. But for Geno Auriemma, letting go was never an option. Because by now, it wasn't just about Caitlin Clark as a player. It was about what she represented. A changing of the guard, a shift in power, a reminder that the sport he had ruled for decades was no longer orbiting around him. And instead of accepting it, Geno did the only thing he knew how to do: talk. Interview after interview, podcast after podcast, Clark's name was never far from his lips. He just couldn't resist. And every time, the pattern repeated. A little praise wrapped in control. A compliment followed by a disclaimer. A nod followed by a dig. But then he went further. He stopped talking about her as just a player and started trying to own her entire movement. In one shocking interview, he framed the explosion of women's basketball as something he and his generation had built. He claimed that the sudden rise in popularity wasn't really about Clark at all. No, according to Geno, the world just jumped on Caitlin Clark's back after years of work by people like him. Read that again. He didn't say Clark carried the sport into new heights. He said the sport was already climbing and the media just happened to hitch a ride on her shoulders. The disrespect is breathtaking. Because in that moment, Geno revealed exactly what this was about. Not basketball, not even Clark herself. It was about power. The power to control the narrative, the power to decide who gets credit, the power to keep the spotlight shining on him, even as the world was clearly turning its attention elsewhere. He wanted to remind everyone that he was the architect, that he was still in charge, that if Clark was a rocket ship, then he was the launch pad. But here's the truth. Caitlin Clark didn't ride anyone's wave. She was the wave. She wasn't lifted by the system, she disrupted it. She didn't ask for permission to shine, she created her own spotlight, and the world followed. And that's what made Geno's obsession so obvious. He couldn't stop mentioning her because he couldn't stand being left out of her story. Every time her name trended, every time another record fell, every time another sold-out crowd packed an arena, it was a reminder that she was doing it without him, without his program, without his approval.
So he kept talking. And the more he talked, the clearer it became. Caitlin Clark wasn't just on the court anymore. She was in his head, rent-free. But words only go so far. And soon, Geno found himself in a position where words weren't enough. He needed action. He needed Clark to validate him again, to attach her star power to something with his fingerprints on it. And that's where the $1 million offer comes in. By this point, Geno Auriemma had tried everything. He had dismissed Caitlin Clark. He had belittled her fans. He had tried to control the narrative with comparisons and backhanded compliments. And when all of that failed, he tried to reframe her rise as just another product of the system he created. But none of it worked. Clark kept climbing, and Geno? He kept slipping further into the shadows. That's when a new opportunity appeared, one that seemed, at least on the surface, like his shot at redemption. A chance to reassert himself, not just as a coach, but as a visionary, a businessman, a power broker in the future of women's basketball. The opportunity was called Unrivaled.
a bold new 3-on-3 basketball league co-founded by Breanna Stewart and Napisa Collier, with Geno deeply involved in the creation. The league had money, it had hype, it had ambition. What it didn't have was a face. And that's where the desperation became crystal clear. Because for all the big names attached to the project, for all the promises of innovation and excitement, there was only one player who could truly legitimize it. Only one name powerful enough to bring in the millions of fans who had just discovered women's basketball. Only one star big enough to carry the entire league on her shoulders. Caitlin Clark. So after years of dismissals and insults, Geno finally did the unthinkable. He came knocking. Reports confirmed that Unrivaled made Clark a massive offer, over $1 million for just an 8-week season, one of the richest contracts ever offered in women's basketball history. Think about the irony. The same man who once wouldn't even pick up the phone to call her in high school was now holding out $1 million check, practically begging her to save his project. The same coach who told the world her hype wasn't real was now trying to cash in on that exact hype. The same coach who said her fans were delusional was now depending on those same fans to buy tickets, stream games, and make his league profitable. It was the ultimate reversal, a role swap so dramatic it could have been scripted for Hollywood. Geno had gone from gatekeeper to salesman, from kingmaker to beggar, and the fate of his league, his vision, maybe even his legacy, rested in the hands of the very player he once brushed aside. Make no mistake, this wasn't just business. This was personal. By securing Clark, he could rewrite history. He could say, "See, she's with us. She's part of the system. She's not bigger than the game. I am." But here's the twist. When the offer landed on Clark's table, she didn't see opportunity. She saw something else. A test, a power play, a desperate grab from the very man who had spent years trying to minimize her. And when she gave her answer, the payback was perfect. The $1 million offer was supposed to be Geno Auriemma's checkmate, a lifeline, a chance to reclaim control of the narrative, to tie his name once again to the brightest star in the game. He had the league, he had the platform. All he needed was Caitlin Clark to sign on the dotted line. But instead of saving him, Clark delivered the final blow. Her answer? No. No explanations, no hesitation, no second thoughts. Just one word that carried more weight than all of Geno's interviews, insults, and excuses combined. And make no mistake, this wasn't just a business decision. This was personal. Because when Clark said no, she wasn't rejecting a contract. She was rejecting him, his approval, his system, his attempt to rewrite her story. That one word was a message. I don't need you. I don't need your league. I don't need your validation. I built my own empire without you, and I'll keep building it long after you're gone. For Geno, the humiliation was total. Think about it. The man who once couldn't be bothered to make a single phone call was now offering her over $1 million, and she turned it down, publicly, without fanfare, without bitterness. Just quiet, decisive rejection. And the fallout? Brutal. Without Clark, Unrivaled lost its star, its magnet, its face. The $1 million offer wasn't just money. It was an admission that the league needed her more than she needed it. And when she said no, the project's hype collapsed before it could even take off. Fans saw it for what it was, the ultimate humiliation. Social media erupted, clowning Geno for thinking Clark would ever bail him out after years of dismissals. The chess match he thought he was playing? Clark ended it with one move. She didn't rant, she didn't argue, she didn't give long speeches about respect or revenge. She just walked away. And that silence cut deeper than anything words could do. Because here's the truth. Geno's era is fading. His power is gone. And Caitlin Clark didn't just take his crown. She burned the throne he sat on. And now the story isn't about whether Geno regrets his mistake. Of course he does. The real question is bigger. What happens when an entire generation of coaches, executives, and power brokers realize they're no longer in control? Because Clark's rejection wasn't just a personal victory. It was a warning shot, a signal to the entire old guard that the game belongs to a new generation now. Players who don't need permission to shine. Players who don't need the approval of gatekeepers. Players who can build their own empires from scratch and walk away from million-dollar checks without blinking. Geno was the first to learn that lesson the hard way, but he won't be the last. So maybe the saying is wrong. Maybe revenge isn't best served cold. Maybe the sweetest revenge is served quietly, with a simple no, and the knowledge that the person who once doubted you now needs you more than anything. And Caitlin Clark, she delivered that revenge flawlessly. In the end, this was never just about $1 million check. It wasn't about a contract. It wasn't even about one coach versus one player. This was about power and who gets to hold it in women's basketball. For decades, Geno Auriemma and the old guard decided who mattered. They were the gatekeepers. They set the rules. If you wanted to be great, you had to go through them. That was the unwritten law of the game. But Caitlin Clark shattered that law. She didn't need UConn's banners to validate herself. She didn't need a legendary coach's blessing to shine. She didn't play by their rules. She made her own. And by saying no to the very man who once dismissed her, she proved something far bigger than herself. The future no longer belongs to the gatekeepers. It belongs to the players. That's why this story stings so much for Geno, because his mistake wasn't just ignoring Clark as a teenager. His mistake was believing the sport couldn't move forward without him. And now the world is watching him fade into the background while the game grows bigger than he ever imagined, without his fingerprints all over it. Clark's rejection wasn't just personal revenge. It was a cultural shift, a line drawn in the sand between the past and the future. A warning shot to every coach, every executive, every so-called power broker who thinks they can still control the narrative. Those days are gone. Because this generation of players doesn't need permission. They don't need approval. They don't need to beg for respect. They've got the fans, the numbers, and the power to control their own destiny. And Caitlin Clark just showed them how it's done. She didn't yell, she didn't argue, she didn't demand. She just kept winning, kept growing, kept building. And when the moment came for her to prove who truly held the power, all it took was one word, one rejection that shook the entire sport. So now the question isn't whether Geno regrets his choices. We know he does. The real question is, who's next? Who will be the next gatekeeper to underestimate the new generation, only to realize too late that the game has passed them by? Because the warning has already been fired. Caitlin Clark delivered it quietly, decisively, and perfectly. The future of basketball is here, and it doesn't ask for permission.